I'm really not into the whole psychic thing, but I was reading a book the other day on the different types of psychics. And did you know a medium can communicate with the dead? Imagine what a large could do. Hey kids, Adam here. Welcome to a brand new series where I'm going to remix a song using Reaper stock plugins. Now here's the kind of rules I'm going to set up for myself, and I may break these as I go on, so I'm not going to write them down or anything. For one, I'm going to use plugins that are built into Reaper that you get on just a standard install of Reaper. So you download it, you install it, whatever plugins show up there. I'm not going to use any like the repack or any of the hundreds of millions of bazillions of free plugins that are out there. I just want to do these with the Reaper's default. There's a lot of different ways I could go down this rabbit hole. I don't want to. As far as how I'm going to do it, I'm going to go through instrument by instrument, and we're starting with the drums in this video, and I'm going to go and just replace the plugins that are there and try to get them to match and sound good. And I think it's probably a better way to do this. The other way would be to wipe out all the plugins, just start the mix from scratch. I think that would take entirely too long, and then it would be more of a mix breakdown than an actual going through and comparing plugins to each other. I think that would be much more involved than probably I'm willing to put in the time for. Next, I'm going to try to get as close to the original as possible, but with the understanding that there may not be some replacements on these plugins. I'm going to try to get as close as possible with the understanding that they may not. I will do some comparisons as I go through and as I do this, but I also want to make sure that everyone knows that I'm not trying to make this an exact one-for-one copy. It just won't be possible. As long as the mix sounds good, that's really the goal. And I just want to say I haven't really done any dry runs on this. I've gone through and I've written down some notes. You'll see me kind of glance to my other monitor, my notes here for a second, once in a while. I haven't really done this, so this is going to be, you're learning this as I'm learning it, and we'll see what we can do. Let's head over to Reaper and well, that was a bad idea. So it turns out trying to do this without a dry run was not very well thought out on my part. I thought it would be easy to just go back and forth between plugins and set the levels and kind of get things sounding the same. And well, it was just very time consuming. So I went through exactly what I was going to say. I brought up 2 tracks, I made duplicates of them, and I went in and I started messing around with the first plugin. 18 minutes into the recording, I was done with the kick. I figured no one wants to watch Dad play with a kick drum for 18 minutes. That just makes no sense. So here's what I did. Let's go back into Reaper. All right, so you can see here, all of the yellow tracks are the original drums. All of these light blue tracks are the new drums. And what I did is I went through every track. I went and matched as close as I could to the effects that I had using Reaper stock effects. I had to make 2 changes. I have a gated reverb, and I'm using that using Wave's Rverb, and there is a gated verb setting, and it takes care of everything for you. There are ways to do it in Reaper using like ReaVerbate and ReaGate, but you have to set up separate sends. You have to send each track twice, one before and one after, and it's a big pain. I didn't want to have to do that, so I decided, you know what, we're just going to get rid of the gated verb. It didn't add that much. It was pretty low in volume. The other thing was I had a separate plate reverb just for my snare, and that's over here called drum plate. I decided, you know what, I'm just going to use a short reverb that I have on my projects anyway, and that's how I'm going to do this. So those are the 2 changes, other than, making everything identical. Everything else I got pretty close. Let me just play you, and I'll alternate between the drums, and I'll put something up on the screen and let you know which one's which. I'll just put like Waves versus Reaper stock plugins, and you can kind of hear what's going on. We'll start with the originals first. And I'm just going to pick a section of the song that has kind of a lot of stuff going on. Here we go. So there's some differences. You can hear some differences, but let's get into each of these tracks and I'll show you the differences. For starters, let's do the drum bus. Now, what I had on the Waves plugin here on the left, and for each of these tracks I do on the left side will be, or I don't know which way you're looking at. No, on your left side, it's on the left side. That's the Waves plugins. The right side will be the replaced Reaper plugins. Now, there are a couple cases where I'm actually using Reaper plugins. I didn't have to do much. But for this, let's just kind of go into it. So I'm using RChannel, which is just a channel strip. It's 2 EQ moves and some compression. I did the same EQ moves in ReaEQ, and I used ReaComp with kind of a default setting. I'll get into that in a minute. And then Kramer tape. There's no comparison to Kramer tape in Reaper. There is JS saturation, which I do like a lot, and I use in conjunction with Kramer tape, but I was able to get it close, not exact. So that's the drum bus. We'll get into some sound comparisons here in a second. We'll do the kick. And the kick, I was using the PuigTec trick of doing the boost and attenuation at the same for the bass. I actually did the same thing for the treble here. I wasn't able to do that. I decided to leave it out completely. So going to the SSL channel here, I have a gate, which I used ReaGate to kind of get all the extra stuff out of there, extra snare and cymbal wash and everything. Then I have EQ. I did the same types of EQ moves that I have here. So I have a high pass filter at 20 Hertz. I have a big boost at, this is over here at, 5.9K of like 9 dB. And I did a shelf here, and I did a little bit more, and I did a little bit change around the frequencies to make it sound the same. I have a high mids at like 1.85K of a little over 6 dB. That's over here. And I had to do a little bit more to get it to sound the same. I'm doing a low cut, 360 Hertz, 3 dB. I did basically the same thing here. It's a little bit more. And then I have a little bass boost, and that's at 58 Hertz. I did that exactly the same thing. I did a 3. It's actually sitting at 5. I lowered a little bit down to 3 because I thought it was thumping a little bit too much. For compression on the kick. So here's where there was a little trick that I found. John Tidy, our good friend over at the Reaper blog, did an article, and if I can find it again, I will put a link in the description of how to get an SSL compressor sound in ReaComp. And there are some different things. I didn't really do the fast attack or anything, but the main things are attack and release, a little bit of knee, so there's a 0.5 dB of the knee size, and a 1.5 millisecond RMS, and that just helps average things out and make things a little bit better. It sounds very, very similar with just the compressor on it, comparing those two. And then I have this plugin is actually free. It's called SK10. I have a video that I'll put a link to up here of 3 ways to add like a bass boost or a bass dump to your mix. What I used is the JS Huge Booty Bass Enhancer because, I mean, you can't go wrong with that name. I had to do a lot of things different to kind of get it to match. The settings don't match up anywhere near close to what they did in the plugin. That was it for effects on the kick track. Let's get into all of my sends, or what I call sends. What I decided to do with this is when I got to a send, I would talk about it in the video. I've already kind of missed one, but we'll get back to that in a second. Let's look at parallel compression first. So if I bring up the original track, so the original track for all my sends is going to be in red. The new one with Reaper only is going to be in this kind of hot pink color, just so I can differentiate the two. So in my parallel compression on my drums, I use the SSL compressor, kind of a crush setting here, 10:1 ratio, 10 millisecond attack, a 0.1 second release, which I believe is 100 milliseconds. You can also use the auto setting on this. I kind of go back and forth just to figure out whichever sounds better. And then I bring the threshold down and kind of crush it, add a lot of makeup gain. And then I add some EQ just to do a high pass filter about 80 Hertz, low pass filter about 13K to just roll off some of the low rumbles and some of the high like hiss that can happen with a lot of compression. Let's bring up what I did for the Waves or for Reaper stuff. I used a very similar setup. I did 10 millisecond attack, 100 millisecond release. and I kept the ratio 10:1, and I kept the knee in the RMS because it's kind of similar to that SSL channel compressor. What I had to do is I had to lower the high pass filter quite a bit because there was a little bit of thump kind of missing. And even though I'm really not trying to add thump into this parallel compression, I wanted to kind of match it up as best as I could. I'll go back and forth between these two, and you can hear which one's which. I'll put text on the screen so you know which one's which. So there are some obvious differences. A lot of it has to do with the actual tone of the snare, which we'll get to next. I did my best. I think this will sound just fine in a mix though, and that was really the goal. If it doesn't sound the same, at least make sure it works in the mix. Let's move on to the next send, which is the clipper track. All I'm really doing with the clipper is adding some distortion. And if I bring these up here, on my original clipper, I'm using the Abbey Saturator. I'm adding just a bunch of kind of not necessarily distortion, not necessarily saturation, kind of right in the middle. I use this preset of drum room crush, and I kind of tweaked it a little bit. Then I added a EQ on there. I used ReaEQ again, another high pass and a low pass trick. I do that on a lot of different sends just to get out some of the extra rumble and noise. For this one, I decided to use JS saturation. I just cranked it up to 100. I did an EQ and I kept it the same thing. These are going to sound different, but let's go back and forth. I could probably use JS distortion and dial that in, but I felt this wasn't adding a whole lot. It's almost adding just more attack than anything. So we'll move on from here. The last one on the kick is this max bass track. And for the original track, I use RBass from Waves. I just set it like this 66 and I bring down the intensity a little bit. And for the Reaper one, I use this huge booty bass enhancer again. I did a little bit different settings. I set it at 66 hertz again, and then I had to kind of mess with some volume to get it to match. I got this one close. Before and after. There's a little more extra tail on the RBass one, a little bit of that. It doesn't really matter too much. It hasn't really changed things. Let's do a before and after the kick with all of the plugins engaged. Here's the first, and we'll go back and forth. They're close. I think there's a little bit more definition on the one with the Waves plugins, and I think there's a little bit more thump on the Reaper plugins. Just kind of the way it worked out. I think they're gated almost exactly, compressed almost identical, and I think that was good for this exercise. Let's move on to the snare. As you guys know, I struggle with the snare on every one of my mixes. Let's look at the original track first, and actually, there was a third cheat I had in here. I lied. This SnareBuzz plugin, I did not have a workable bottom snare track. So I'm adding the SnareBuzz plugin. I'm going to leave it in. I'm going to treat it almost like an amp sim, where that's the original sound that's coming in, and I'll treat it after that. So I used multiband gates to gate things out and kind of get a better control over the frequencies that I'm gating. I used SSL to get all the compression and EQ. I used Kramer tape, and then I had some frequencies that didn't really sound that great, so I put an EQ after the fact using Renaissance EQ. For the Reaper side, left the SnareBuzz on. I used ReaGate, and I just kind of dialed in, getting a decent sound. I used ReaEQ, and I added these bands in here after the fact. Otherwise, the EQ is matching as much as I can the SSL. I did the compressor with the standard, what we're going to call the standard ReaComp SSL settings. Then I added JS saturation on it. Let's get into some of the there's a couple extra sends on the snare. What I did use is the drums exciter. And if I look at the original one, this is using the Aphex vintage exciter. And then again, I've just put some EQ on just to take off a little bit of the low end. And then I did a kind of a high pass filter or a low pass filter. There's really no plugin that sounds like this for waves. What there is I just searched for the word excite and I saw, hey, there's something called JS Exciter. So I kind of played around with the frequency and the gain and everything. I got it close. Let's play these two back to back. And you see it just, that's about as close as I was able to get. I could probably tweak a little bit and screw around with it, but it was adding in some actual high frequencies. The whole point of an exciter is to add in harmonic registers without actually adding an EQ. And I think the JS exciter adds too much EQ and not enough of just the harmonic frequencies. So that's one of the things that didn't really work out well with this. And then the last one is the verb, and we'll get into the short verb now. Go all the way over to the right here. My original reverb, and this is on all the Waves plugins. I put a 1176 in front of it with maybe a 3 dB or so gain reduction and some pretty conservative settings to just kind of tame down what's coming into the reverb. I use Rverb. I use a default setting called Hall 2. I just kind of like the way it sounds. High pass and low pass filter like I've done in almost everything. Then I did a Waves S1 imager just to widen it just a tad. I'm going up to 1.2 here where the default is 1. On my Reverb Short 2 track, I did the JS 1175 compressor, which is a pretty similar copy to the 1176 Waves. It does not have any of the analog sounds in it, but in some of the attacks and releases are a little bit different in the way that they do it, where in the Waves and in the original, when you turn it up, you're actually making it faster for attack and release. And this one is more of a traditional, what you would expect in a compressor to do, where fast attack is lower, slower attack is higher. Next, I used ReaVerbate, which is the default Reaper plugin for reverb. Mess with the room size, put the dampening up all the way, a little bit of initial delay, and then I put a low pass on it to kind of almost mimic the original sound. And then I use the same EQ, high pass and low pass, and there's a JS stereo width plugin. I just kind of went by ear to make sure it kind of fit, and it was kind of close. One thing I noticed in doing this exercise is that Reaper really kind of doesn't have many good reverb options. There are two built in. There's ReaVerbate and there's Reverb, or ReaVerb, or however you want to pronounce it. ReaVerb requires impulse response to load in. And the way I looked at it is if you're going to do that, you're probably looking at other reverbs anyway, because you have to get those impulse responses somewhere else. It's not built into Reaper. So I didn't even use that plugin. I'm only using this ReaVerbate. It would not be my first choice in reverbs, but it still works in a pinch. Let me compare the two. First, I'll start with the Waves, then I'll go with the Reaper plugins. You'll notice the Waves reverb sounds much further away. I can't do anything else. This is what I'm left with. And for this exercise, this is what we got. Let's get back to the snare drum. And we are ready to do a comparison side by side of the Wave snare versus the Reaper snare. Start with the Waves. they're close. There are a lot of EQ things I couldn't get to match perfectly. There were some things with the multi-band gate that ReaGate didn't really do. And then Kramer tape actually added a lot to this one. In fact, let me mute Kramer tape out and compare the two here. They're a lot similar with the Kramer tape on. They're much more similar. So let's move on. There's one little track in here, which is a clap track. And what I did is I'll put a card up here on how I did this. I used the exciter and the drum plate, which I'm no longer using, and the Verb. They're not going to sound the same, but they're going to work just fine. So here's just a before and after of those. There's some volume differences in there, but it's mainly the reverb is making them sound much more farther away on the original, but it's a clap. It has reverb on it. It's going to sound just fine. Let's get to the toms. So the original ones, I'm using multi-band gate. I'm using ReaEQ and ReaComp. So this is really easy. All I had to do was take multi-band gate and replace it with ReaGate. So let's do a before and after of the toms. And let me just solo. We'll just do the whole kit during this fill. They sound pretty similar. They were, like I said, they were the easiest to work with and don't have any different sends on those. Overheads are going to be next. For the original overheads, for some reason, I didn't create a folder track and process these in one folder. I did it on separate tracks, but I'm using ReaEQ. All I'm really doing is a high pass filter up here at like 500 hertz. I want to get rid of all the mud and all the gunk and all like the kick and the bassy of the snare, like the definition of the snare. And I want to have them just be overheads. And then I use the SSL comp that works really well on overheads. Kind of a standard setting. For the Reaper side, I just used EQ and compression, and that was it. And then the two sends, the exciter and the Verb. I didn't even bother with, there's really nothing else to do. I use the same exact EQ, try to match up the compression the same. They're similar. Let's do it kind of before and after. The second to last thing we have is the room mic here. Now, I'll put a video up here to my room, how to get huge drums using a room mic. This doesn't have all the techniques because I didn't really hone it in until after this song was done. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm using a giant reverb, a whole bunch of compression, taking all the low end and high end off with EQ, and then adding a saturator on it. What it does is it makes it sound like you're kind of far away and you hear this coming out of a club. So I'll just play the room mic in the original one. Kind of a cool sound. What I do then is I put the fader all the way down to 0 and I blend it in. You can watch the video and see what I did. Let's see what I did on the Reaper side. For reverb, all we have is ReverBate. So I did a kind of a setting that I was messing around with. So what I ended up doing is I put a ReaEQ and I did just kind of a giant low shelf and kind of took a lot of it out. Then I added my compressor and I did the 1175. Then I added more EQ, and this was actually the same as the one over here. I added saturation and just used JS saturation with kind of a lower setting. After the saturation, I noticed it was still much brighter than the what the Abbey Road saturator was doing. And if you notice on the Abbey Road saturator, I'm doing a bunch of EQ and cutting off a bunch of stuff here. So I took out the JS tilt equalizer, and this is a neat little plugin. You essentially just give it a frequency, and it does this or that to the high and low ends on the other side of it. So I was able to get it close to what this is. Let's do a back and forth on the room mic only, and I'll turn the volumes up in post so you can hear them better. And you notice they really don't sound anywhere near like, I wasn't able to get that thump of the kick coming through at all. Both ReaVerbate and saturation just it basically killed the low end of that. It still adds a little bit. It's not going to add as much. What can I do? Not much I can do here. The last actual track is a bongos track. It shows up in one place in the song, and I thought it was cool, so I added it in. And all it has on it is this reverb. It actually sounds really, really close, even though we had that issue with the reverb. It's just the way the reverb acts to certain frequencies, I think. So let's compare drums now. I think that's all of the tracks, how many ever we have here. I will go back and forth between the kit only, and then we'll add it in the mix and see what it sounds like. So here, start out. Let's try in the mix. So there are the drum comparisons. There's definitely some differences. You can notice a lot of different things. I like some things in the Waves better. I like some things in the Reaper better. The main point that I wanted to prove in doing this series of videos is you can use stock Reaper plugins in a mix and that they do sound good. And I think everyone knows that, but I think without seeing it, you just kind of figure there's no way this thing that's so small and so cheap and so easy to use can do a mix. We're going to see throughout the series how it sounds, and then we'll do some before and after comparisons of the entire mix. For now, this is the drum video. Look for the bass video next. Hopefully that'll be a little bit more straightforward. In the meantime, make sure you click like in this video, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell thing, share it out, leave me a comment. Let me know if this is interesting to you or not. Let me know if there's other plugins that I'm missing here that you maybe work better. There's a lot of stuff in the default Reaper, especially the JS plugins that are kind of hidden in there. And if there's another reverb that I don't know about, that might help me. If you can get that to me before I do guitars, that may really help. So until next time, have yourselves an amazing week. All my sends are aux tracks or buses or bus sends or aux bus track sends. Do you guys hear that? There's a cricket somewhere in my house. But he's not chirping, he's just constant. So maybe it's not a cricket, it's one of those constant crickets. Maybe he has a lot of reverb on him. But if this comes through on the microphone, I'm gonna be really upset.